From the Toronto Star, I'm Rudgy Mudler, and this matters. For many people, when we start talking about UFOs, we are about to enter into tinfoil hat territory. But some people are taking this more seriously, including the US Pentagon.
In the language of the US Department of Defense, these are unidentified aerial phenomena, videos which add fuel to the belief of some that we are not alone.
And members of the US government, which will publicly table a report this year of what that country's security agencies know about unidentified aerial phenomena. And in recent years, there have been some really eye-opening disclosures in this field. Things are a bit quieter up here in Canada, although according to a recent ufology research report, sightings of UFOs were up during the pandemic in Canada, rising 46% in 2020 over 2019. Today, we are going to be discussing some recent reporting that perhaps sheds a bit of light on what happens when a pilot or aviator has an encounter with something in our airspace that they cannot identify. And if you are out there adjusting that tinfoil hat, let's be clear. We are not going to be talking about aliens, but what the Canadian government documents say about unidentified flying objects. Daniel Otis is a freelance journalist whose work has appeared in Vice, CTV News Online, and many other outlets, including the Toronto Star, where he was one of my colleagues a few years ago. He's been doing some interesting research and reporting on UFOs and how Canada deals with them. So Daniel, thanks so much for making the time to join us today.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so I know there are some people who think we are going to be entering into some tinfoil hat territory here, but, there have been some really interesting disclosures in the US in the past few years that I want to get to, but I think what's really interesting is you've done two really recent pieces about how Canada deals with UFOs. Let's start with your first article. You got an access information request report about an incident to Canadian military. What did it say, but also, what does it mean?
So this report is a faxed intelligence report that was sent from a Royal Canadian Air Force squadron to Transport Canada on January 6, 2019. The report was sent about 3 hours after a medical transport flight over northern Manitoba reported that, quote, an inexplicable bright light followed them at the same altitude and speed. So what this report showed, the one that was obtained by access to information request, it shows that if civilian aircraft spot objects or lights that they can't easily identify, air traffic controllers are notifying the Air Force, and then the Air Force in turn is notifying Transport Canada.
Okay, so how big a deal is that, and what exactly does that mean?
It's unclear how big of a deal it is. It shows that there is a reporting mechanism for these types of observations in Canada. But I honestly have yet to uncover any evidence that these sorts of reports are investigated further or followed up on. All it tells us is that if a pilot sees something, the Air Force is going to know, and the Air Force squadron that's being notified is affiliated with NORAD, which is the joint US-Canadian Air Defense Pact. And we know that Transport Canada is being informed, but really there's no evidence as of yet that any of these cases are looked into any further.
For the longest time, say last 50 years, most governments have been obfuscating about this sort of stuff. In 2017, the New York Times revealed that the US has a UFO tracking program. So what we're trying to say is that by discovering the existence of this sort of puts us in line with other countries on how they deal and sort of track unidentified flying phenomena, right?
I would say yes and no. The US clearly has a UFO tracking program. The Pentagon has openly admitted that they study things like this. Canada has not. So my stories revealed that a reporting mechanism exists. My story also revealed that, multiple flights have reported unusual objects and lights. But in terms of whether or not the Canadian government or military is actually tracking and researching these things, we, as of yet, don't know. And I'm going to keep digging to, find an answer to that question. But so far, the folks I've spoken to within the RCAF, off the record, have told me that they don't have any indication that this is being looked into further.
Well, I wanted to say, because I did love this one quote in your story, which was for Vice, we should say, and it was from a Transport Canada spokesperson. And I quote, Reports of unidentified objects can rarely be followed up on as they are, as the title implies, unidentified. So you've got a little bit of a catch-22 there, right?
Well, yeah, and when I found this unclassified fact, it really revealed that there was sort of a game of kick the can happening here. The civilian air traffic control punts the report over to the Air Force, which punts it over to Transport Canada, and Transport Canada is giving me a statement saying that they're not really interested.
Okay, now let's talk about the second piece that you did for Vice. Now this looks at the database of a lot of reports of these unidentified flying objects done by commercial pilots. I want to get to some of the examples, but I guess we should talk a little bit about the process again. How does that work? So these commercial pilots see something and then they send it to the air traffic controllers?
Yeah, basically. So if you're flying above Canada and you see something unusual, if you notify air traffic controllers, that will generate a report. Basically, any kind of incident that happens in Canadian airspace will generate a report. And these go into a system operated by Transport Canada called the Civil Aviation Daily Occurrence Report System, or CADORS for short. So anything that's observed in Canadian airspace, any problems, even if there's, let's say, a drunken, unruly passenger, a bird strike, a mechanical issue, that all goes into the system. And there are hundreds of thousands of reports in there.
Can you talk about some of the examples that you've recently gone through and found in there and take a look at?
Yeah, I found dozens and dozens. The piece that appeared in Vice highlighted about 10 of them. Some of those included an American Boeing 747 cargo flight from New York to Alaska in 2018 that reported, quote, an object flying sporadically estimated at 60 to 80,000 feet and moving at Mach 4. That's 4 times the speed of sound. And while there's no way of really, that they could have measured the speed of this thing, they reported something moving sporadically and very fast. Another one involves, there's a Porter flight from 2016. And I remember this story actually made a few headlines at the time when I was at the Toronto Star. And this story involves a Porter flight from Ottawa to Toronto's downtown Billy Bishop Airport, having to take an evasive maneuver because there was something that appeared, quote, like an upright or donut inner tube that was directly in their flight path. So this flight in November 2016 dives to avoid this object, and the flight attendants who were in the process of securing the cabin received injuries when they were thrown into the cabin structure during this evasive maneuver. Here's another one. This one's from Saskatchewan, 2015, when, quote, multiple aircraft reported a very large object with a small white light in the middle surrounded by a halo. Here's another one, an Air Canada Express flight from 2016 going between Montreal and Toronto reported, quote, they had crossed an unidentified flying object, round in shape, flying at an approximate speed of 300 knots. That's like 555 kilometers an hour. So, all of these things could be drones or balloons or, conventional aircraft. And I'm not arguing that any of this is aliens, but, the point in presenting the story is that trained aviators in Canadian airspace are encountering things that they can't easily identify. There's no indication that our government or military is looking into this. And, by presenting this material, I'm driven to say, listen, these folks shouldn't be dismissed or ridiculed. We shouldn't stigmatize the reporting of things like this. Someone who's a trained aviator sees something that they can identify that clearly has some flight safety and national security implications, and it's worthy of an investigation.
Most pilots don't want to make these reports, right? Out of fear, perhaps, and of that stigma. I think there was one specifically that it took a couple of years before it actually got into that database. Is that right?
Yeah, so the reason that one in particular, it would have been uploaded later into the database, probably because maybe they were looking into it. I don't know. But in terms of the stigma, it's a huge deal. I spoke to a former Air Force pilot named Jock Williams, and he guessed that maybe 90% of these types of sightings aren't being reported. I've had several other Air Force and commercial pilots approach me, telling me similar stories. And, they told me that they don't want to be laughed at. They don't want to be called the UFO guy. They don't want to suffer any career consequences. I've heard stories from other people, and I can totally understand it. Why would anyone want to subject themselves to that kind of ridicule when, the topic is so stigmatized in our society.
We'll be right back. This is interesting about this stigma. I really do think the tenor of this conversation is changing, right? I think because of these disclosures in the US. Now, let's talk a little bit about those. I mean, we know that the US has some sort of a tracking system. I believe the Navy has verified 3 videos with unexplained phenomena, and there's talk of more. And I think that the other really, really big one recently was there have been some U.S. politicians speaking about this, in particular, Marco Rubio, earlier this year. So what do you make of all of that? And is this changing this conversation at all in any way?
I think the conversation is changing in the United States. In the US, we're seeing coverage of this topic in really mainstream outlets like the Washington Post, the New York Times, CNN. These are outlets that aren't known for dealing with wacky topics. I don't see that as happening as much in Canada. Our politicians aren't speaking openly about it. Our mainstream media outlets don't really touch the topic too much, but it's phenomenal to see that politicians in the US are coming out. Marco Rubio has actually done multiple interviews in the past year speaking about it.
Well, we have things flying over military installations, over military exercises and other places, and we don't know what it is. It isn't ours. It isn't anything that's registered with the FAA, and in many cases exhibits attributes of things we've never seen, technology, the kinds of technology we haven't seen before, or at least that's what it seems like. I think you have to know what it is, or we have to try to know what it is. That's my view of it, without any preconceived notions. Maybe there's a logical explanation. Maybe it's something that can be explained away. Maybe it's a foreign adversary who's made a technological leap, as you heard the former DNI said. Whatever it is, we need to know the answer to it. The problem with this issue is every time you raise it, people get all nervous. Oh, does this mean UFOs and aliens and extraterrestrial? We don't have to go that far. It's very simple. There are things flying over national security installations. We don't know who they are. We don't know what it is. It isn't ours. We need to find out.
So has Mark Warner, who's the senator from Virginia. Now, Mark Warner and Marco Rubio are the 2 heads of the U.S. Senate Intelligence Committee. And in interviews, Rubio has suggested that he's, seen other documents and videos that haven't been released to the public. So I get the sense that he's speaking from data. He's speaking based on data that he's encountered. It's very interesting. And then former Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, who also led the Senate Intelligence Committee during his day, he's speaking openly on the topic too, about it being a national security threat. So there definitely is that momentum happening in the United States. One thing that's very interesting, in late December, as part of Trump's final COVID emergency bill, there was a provision that was sort of buried in there that I believe was initiated by Marco Rubio that's requiring U.S. defense and intelligence agencies to come together to create a unclassified UFO report for Congress by the middle of this year. So things are happening in the US, maybe not as much here, but I'm very curious to see what this report will contain. And one shouldn't get their hopes up, but regardless, it'll be interesting to see some official acknowledgments about the topic.
All UFOs research in the past has basically been blanket denials or programs that have made to obfuscate or hide these things, particularly in the US, which we know about a ton of these things. Why do you think this has changed? What do you think has happened?
I think there's a growing recognition that sightings like this do occur, and that credible trained observers, such as military personnel or aviators, that if they can't immediately identify something, that's probably worthy of some attention. I think the real game changer in the conversation, though, is probably the groundbreaking New York Times coverage. So as you previously mentioned, in 2017, they ran a story that revealed that the Pentagon had a UFO tracking program. And the reporters in that, Ralph Blumenthal and Leslie Keane, have continued following the topic. They've interviewed current and former military personnel, and their reporting, sort of the sobriety of their reporting, backed by, really reputable expert testimonies, I think is changing the conversation. Once other mainstream media outlets saw that the New York Times was handling this in a serious way, I believe others began to look at it more earnestly, including myself. I've always had a sort of passing interest in this, but it wasn't something I really took seriously as something worthy of digging into until I saw that New York Times reporting, which made me think, how can I contribute to this conversation? And from a Canadian perspective, because there just really is not a lot of data on Canada in terms of the UFOs.
You've been talking to a lot of people within the Canadian UFO research community. First off, what do they think about these disclosures in the US and how could they potentially apply here? And then also, I'm curious how your recent stories went over.
There's a lot of both excitement and wariness about this, upcoming US report. Some folks that I speak to are of the belief that it's going to be paradigm changing. Other folks I speak to say that we shouldn't expect anything from the US government because of, the years of cover-ups and things like that. There's definitely a lot of chatter about it, but no one's quite sure what to expect. My stories, I've actually been getting a lot of positive feedback. I mean, you as a journalist know sometimes you can write a story about the most seemingly inane topic and then have thousands of people want to rip out your throat. This one was just, the response has been overwhelmingly positive from those both in the UFO and aviation communities. The sorts of documents and reports I was looking at are known to some of the more longstanding UFO investigators in our country. So they see that, my writing is sort of vindication. It's something that they've been looking into. I think one issue they face in getting mainstream acceptance of the sort of work they're doing is that, in a lot of people's heads, UFO researchers are sort of looked at the same way as people who are grunting in the forest for Bigfoot or out camping out to try and find the Loch Ness Monster. But I think the New York Times reporting is changing that conversation. And I think, not to toot my own horn, but I'm trying to present material here that just sticks to what the documents say. I'm not ever going to offer theories about what any of this could be. I suggest it could be drones. I suggest it could be balloons. Who knows? It's just, there's data that says trained, credible observers are seeing things they can't understand. So, and that's what I'm focusing on. And, the response has been really positive.
Hey, listen, when I pitched it to my boss, obviously the first joke out of his mouth was, hey, now I'm Fox Mulder, right? So the X-Files jokes had to come out quickly. And hey, this is one of those things, I'm obviously, as a sci-fi nerd, personally been interested in this. So I do keep an open mind. And I love the fact that you are looking at this from a very documented journalistic approach. We talked earlier, you said that there was some stuff from the reports that you couldn't actually get into your pieces. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I can give you a few examples. Like I said, I found dozens upon dozens of these reports in the Canadian government's aviation incident database. So my recent stories highlight about 10.
Is the classic things that we always hear. Shining lights, things propelling themselves without any sort of means of propulsion. Flying saucers. How much does it fall into the sort of stereotypical things that we have heard about this?
The cases I picked mostly involved sort of unusual lights, round objects, things like that. But the CADOR Aviation Incident Database has a lot more than just that kind of thing. I found reports of cylindrical objects, rectangular objects. One was a small sort of jelly bean type thing. A lot of very sort of small objects floating around pilots are seeing. And then there's some, I found some reports that are sort of mysterious, but they suggest that they have conventional explanations, but still really highlight that there's some huge flight safety and national security issues at play here. Here's one I just want to read from 2006. This is a charter flight, passenger flight from Calgary to London. And I believe they were somewhere over Nunavut when they, quote, the crew reported being overtaken by a very fast-moving aircraft at least 2,000 feet above them, generating a contrail and showing a white taillight. The aircraft disappeared into the Aurora Borealis after approximately 5 minutes. NORAD and the Air Traffic Control Center were not aware of any aircraft in the area. So here's a case where we have an aircraft with a white taillight and generating a contrail, which shows that it's probably a conventional aircraft. But this report still highlights that there's a flight safety issue. This thing buzzed pretty much over a passenger plane. And not only that, that NORAD, which is supposed to be defending and monitoring North American airspace. We have a very fast-moving jet going over a passenger plane, and NORAD doesn't know it's there. So even if these things are, round saucer UFOs or bright lights or things that maybe are more clearly conventional, I think they all underscore the flight safety and national security issue that these observations bring up.
Well, Daniel, I think this has been a fantastic conversation for us. I know our Vinay Menon, who's a good friend of mine, has written on this a couple times this year, and he has written that 2021 could be the year of the UFO. We obviously are all going to be looking forward to that U.S. report. But is there anything that I didn't ask that you think our listeners should know about this topic?
I guess I would just sort of underscore that, when you hear about UFO sightings in the media, that, it would be great if people could just sort of suspend disbelief and for a second, take them for what they are. People are seeing things they can identify, and, that they shouldn't be ridiculed for that. They shouldn't be ignored. That's the overall thing I'm hoping to get across here, that we need to take this seriously. The US Pentagon is. So maybe we as a society and us in Canada should be taking the matter pretty seriously too.
Daniel, that's really, really great for us. I really, really want to thank you for your time today.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
Daniel Otis is a freelance journalist, writing in several outlets, and recently has been writing about UFOs and how Canada deals and tracks with them. That's it for today. Thanks so much for joining us. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Rajan Budler, Adrian Chung, and Saba Etisas. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.